Maria's hand trembled as she reached for her radio, muscle memory warring with disbelief. The luminous figure had vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving only the acrid smell of candle wax and something else, roses maybe, though no flowers grew in this concrete wasteland. The 14 German shepherds now sat in perfect formation around the child, their earlier aggression replaced by an almost reverent stillness. "Control. This is Detective Santos," she whispered into her radio, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic. The situation is under control. Copy that, Detective. Do you need backup? EMT is standing by." Maria stared at the little girl, Jana, according to the Amber Alert that had brought half the force to this forgotten corner of the city. The child hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Her small frame seemed impossibly fragile against the backdrop of crumbling brick and broken glass, yet there was something in her posture that suggested she was exactly where she needed to be. "Negative on backup," Maria said, surprising herself. "Give me 10 minutes." She clipped the radio back to her belt and took a careful step forward. The lead K9 handler, Officer Rick Martinez, caught her eye from across the circle. His face was pale, his usually steady hands shaking as he maintained his grip on Duke's leash. "Martinez," she called softly. "You okay?" "I've been working with Duke for 6 years," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Never seen anything like this. They all went crazy at the same time, like someone flipped a switch. Then that woman," he trailed off, shaking his head. Maria nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was acknowledging. In 2 decades of police work, she'd learned to trust her instincts, to separate fact from fiction with surgical precision. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. The rational part of her mind, the part that had gotten her through detective training, through crisis negotiation certification, through the aftermath of losing Sophia, scrambled for explanations. Mass hysteria, gas leak, shared delusion brought on by stress and fog, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came with working the graveyard shift. But she had felt something when the figure appeared, a warmth that started in her chest and spread outward, dissolving the chronic ache she'd carried for 3 years. For just a moment, the weight of Sophia's last text message, "Mom, I'm scared," had lifted from her shoulders. "Hey there, sweetheart." Maria crouched down, staying just outside the circle of dogs. Up close, she could see that Jana was maybe 7 years old, with dark eyes that seemed far too old for her face. The child's clothes were dirty but intact, no visible injuries. "I'm Detective Santos. I'm here to help you." Jana's gaze met hers, and Maria felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Not of the child herself, but of something in those eyes, a familiar emptiness, the hollow look of someone who had witnessed too much too soon. "Can you tell me your name?" Maria asked gently, though she already knew from the alert. According to the report, Jana Morales had been missing for 6 hours, father deceased, mother working double shifts at the hospital. The girl had been staying with her grandmother when she'd simply vanished from her bedroom. Jana didn't respond. According to her file, she hadn't spoken since her father's murder 8 months ago, another broken child in a city full of them. The fog shifted, and Maria caught a glimpse of the street beyond the warehouse district. Television news vans were already gathering, their satellite dishes reaching toward the low-hanging clouds like mechanical prayers. Word traveled fast in Cleveland, especially when it involved missing children and inexplicable events. By morning, this place would be swarmed with reporters, curiosity seekers, and the kind of people who collected miracles like trading cards. Maria's phone buzzed. A text from Captain Morrison, media's picking up the story. "Whatever happened out there, we need to control the narrative. Bring the kid in for evaluation." She looked at Jana again, noting how the child's small hand rested on the head of the nearest German shepherd, a massive male who gazed up at her with something approaching adoration. The dog's handler stood 10 feet away, still unable to approach his own partner. "Okay, sweetheart," Maria said, rising slowly. "I think it's time we got you somewhere warm." As if responding to her words, the dogs stood in unison and began to back away, creating a clear path toward Maria's unmarked sedan. The handlers followed, bewildered but relieved to have their partners responding to basic commands again. Maria extended her hand toward Jana, half expecting the child to recoil. Instead, small fingers slipped into hers with surprising trust. The contact sent another wave of that inexplicable warmth up Maria's arm. Together they walked through the parting circle of dogs, past the gathering crowd of officers and emergency personnel, toward the car that would carry them both into whatever came next. Behind them, the fog began to lift, revealing nothing more extraordinary than empty warehouses and broken dreams. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted tonight, something that would change both their lives forever. The drive back to the precinct took them through the heart of Cleveland's sleeping industrial district, where streetlights cast amber pools on empty asphalt and the distant glow of downtown felt like another world entirely. Maria kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Jana, who sat perfectly still in the back seat, her small hands folded in her lap. The child's reflection looked ghostly in the mirror, superimposed over the darkness rushing past the windows. Maria's radio crackled with routine dispatches, a domestic disturbance on the east side, a possible break-in downtown, the ordinary chaos that filled the hours between midnight and dawn. Normal police work, the kind she understood. 23 years on the force had given her a framework for processing violence, grief, and the endless parade of human misery that found its way into official reports. But tonight felt different, as if she'd crossed some invisible threshold that separated the explicable from the impossible. Her phone rang, displaying her partner's number. Detective Tommy Castellanos had been her rock since Sophia's death, the one person who knew when to push and when to let her grieve in silence. "Santos," she answered, keeping her voice neutral. "Maria, what the hell happened out there? Morrison's got half the brass calling him, and the other half are pretending this never happened. The K9 handlers are giving statements that make no sense. I'm bringing the girl in now. She's safe." "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." Tommy's voice carried the weight of their long partnership. "Rick Martinez has been a handler for 6 years. He's telling anyone who'll listen that he saw the Virgin Mary materialize out of thin air. The others are backing him up." "These aren't rookie cops, Maria. These are solid, reliable officers who've never had a single incident report." Maria pulled into the precinct parking lot, noting the unusual number of cars for a Tuesday night, or rather, Wednesday morning. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. Through the windows of the station she could see the bright lights of the main floor, figures moving with the urgent energy that accompanied high-profile cases. "I'll give you the full briefing in 10 minutes, she said, ending the call before Tommy could press further. Jana stirred as Maria turned off the engine, those dark eyes meeting hers in the mirror. For a moment, Maria saw herself as she'd been 3 years ago, before the call that changed everything, before the endless nights of replaying every decision that had led to Sophia being in that school at that exact moment when a broken 19-year-old with his father's gun decided to make the world feel his pain. "Come on, sweetheart," Maria said, opening the rear door. "We're going to get you checked out by a nice doctor. Maybe get you something to eat. Does that sound okay?" Jana slipped out of the car without a word, her small hand automatically seeking Maria's. The contact still sent that strange warmth up her arm, a sensation that reminded her of Sophia's hugs when she was small, before middle school and adolescent independence had created distance between them, before Maria's job had consumed so many evenings and weekends that coming home felt like visiting someone else's life. The precinct lobby buzzed with activity. Captain Morrison stood near the front desk, his grey hair disheveled and his tie loosened. Beside him, Detective Laura Chen from Child Protective Services waited with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to late-night emergencies involving vulnerable children. 2 paramedics flanked the entrance, their equipment bags suggesting they were prepared for anything from physical trauma to psychological evaluation. "Detective Santos." Morrison's voice carried relief and wariness in equal measure. "How's our girl doing?" "She's been through a lot," Maria replied, carefully positioning herself between Yana and the assembled crowd. She needs medical attention and somewhere quiet to rest. Chen stepped forward with the gentle demeanor that made her effective with frightened children. Hi there, Yana. I'm Laura. I work with kids who've had scary experiences. Would you like to sit down while we make sure you're okay? Yana pressed closer to Maria's side, her grip tightening. The child's response triggered something protective in Maria's chest, the same fierce instinct that had driven her to work 17-hour days searching for Sophia's shooter, that had consumed her for months, until Tommy finally forced her to take leave. Maybe we could start slow, Maria suggested. Let her get acclimated. Morrison's expression tightened. We've got procedures, Detective. The girl's been missing for 7 hours. Her grandmother is on her way, but until she arrives, CPS has custody. And we need your statement about what happened out there. Through the lobby windows, Maria could see news vans lining the street, their satellite dishes extended toward the cloudy sky. Inside, her colleagues moved with the heightened awareness that accompanied cases destined for headlines. Everyone wanted to be part of the story, to claim their piece of whatever had happened in that fog-shrouded industrial district. But looking down at Yana, Maria felt only the desire to shield the child from what was coming. The questions, the cameras, the inevitable transformation of a traumatized little girl into a symbol of something larger than herself. 5 minutes, she said to Morrison. Let me get her settled first. Morrison checked his watch with the exaggerated patience of a man accustomed to getting his way. 5 minutes, Detective, then we follow protocol. Maria guided Yana toward a row of chairs near the vending machines, away from the cluster of officials and the growing murmur of conversations that stopped abruptly whenever they passed. The child moved with careful steps, as if the linoleum floor might give way beneath her feet. When they sat down, Yana immediately curled into Maria's side, seeking shelter in the familiar warmth. Detective Santos? A voice cut through the lobby noise. Maria looked up to see a woman in an expensive coat approaching, her press credentials visible even from a distance. Sarah Chen, from Channel 7. We've received reports about an unusual incident involving missing child Yana Morales. Can you comment on? No comment, Morrison intercepted, his bulk blocking the reporter's path. This is an active investigation involving a minor. Media briefing will be scheduled through the appropriate channels. But Sarah Chen's presence was like blood in the water. Through the windows, Maria could see more reporters arriving, their cameras and lights transforming the quiet street into a circus. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy, words out. Miracle Girl, they're calling her. This is about to get crazy. Dr. Patricia Williams, the department's crisis counselor, approached with the measured steps of someone trained to de-escalate volatile situations. Maria, I'd like to do a preliminary assessment, if Yana's comfortable with that. She doesn't speak, Maria said quietly. Hasn't since her father was killed. I understand. Sometimes children communicate in other ways. Dr. Williams crouched down, bringing herself to Yana's eye level. Hello, Yana. I'm Dr. Williams. I help children who've had frightening experiences. You don't have to say anything, but I'd like to make sure you're not hurt. Yana's grip on Maria's hand tightened, her dark eyes shifting between the doctor and the growing crowd of officials. The child's breathing quickened, the first sign of distress Maria had observed since finding her in that industrial wasteland. That's when the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in immediately, bathing the lobby in the red glow of backup lighting. But for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, the Cleveland Police Department's main precinct was plunged into complete darkness. In that brief void, Maria heard something impossible, the sound of wind chimes, delicate and musical, though no such instruments existed anywhere in the building. When the lights returned, everything had changed. Yana was standing now, no longer the frightened child who had clung to Maria's side. She faced the crowd of adults with a stillness that seemed to emanate outward, creating a pocket of absolute quiet in the chaotic lobby. The reporter who had been pressing forward stood frozen, her microphone halfway to her lips. Morrison's radio, which had been squawking with constant updates, fell silent. Even the hum of the vending machines stopped. And in that silence, Yana spoke. "She's coming back." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the lobby with perfect clarity. Every conversation ceased. Every eye turned toward the small girl who hadn't uttered a word in 8 months. "Who's coming back, sweetheart?" Dr. Williams asked gently. "The lady in blue." Yana's eyes met Maria's with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "She says you have to choose." "Choose what?" The question escaped Maria's lips before she could stop it. "Whether to believe." The lobby erupted into motion. Morrison barked orders into his radio. Dr. Williams moved closer, her professional calm wavering. The reporters surged forward despite security efforts to contain her. Through the windows, camera flashes created a strobe effect against the glass. But Maria heard none of it. Her world had contracted to the space between herself and this 7-year-old child who spoke with the weighted certainty of someone much older. She thought of the figure in the fog, the impossible warmth that had dissolved her pain, the peace that had descended when those snarling dogs became silent guardians. She thought of Sophia's last text message, the one she'd been too late to answer, the guilt that had consumed 3 years of sleepless nights, the faith she'd lost somewhere between the funeral and the endless, fruitless investigation that followed. "Detective Santos." Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. "We need to proceed with the evaluation, now." Maria looked down at Yana, who watched her with those 2 old eyes. The choice was forming in her mind, crystallizing like ice around a central truth she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She could step back, let the system take over, file her report about a traumatized child whose temporary recovery was explicable through any number of psychological theories. She could return to her apartment, her case files, her careful routine of surviving one day at a time. Or she could accept that something impossible had happened tonight, something that demanded she risk everything she thought she knew about the world. "5 minutes is up," Morrison said. Maria took a deep breath and made her choice. "I need more time with her," Maria heard herself say, the words emerging before her rational mind could intervene. Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "Detective, we've discussed this. The child needs proper evaluation, and we have procedures." She just spoke for the first time in 8 months. Maria's voice carried an edge that surprised even her. Whatever happened tonight triggered something significant. Rushing her through standard protocols could undo any progress. It was a reasonable argument, grounded in sound psychology. It was also a lie. The truth was that Maria felt something breaking apart inside her chest. The careful wall she'd built around her grief, the methodical skepticism that had carried her through 2 decades of police work, the protective numbness that made it possible to wake up each morning without thinking about Sophia's empty bedroom. Yana's words echoed in her mind. "She says you have to choose. Whether to believe." Dr. Williams stepped forward, her clinical training warring with curiosity. "Maria's right. This is the first verbal communication we've had from Yana since the trauma. We should proceed carefully." But Morrison wasn't interested in psychological nuance. His phone had been buzzing constantly, and Maria could see the weight of external pressure in the tight lines around his eyes. "The grandmother will be here in 20 minutes. Channel 7 is already running teasers about the miracle girl of Cleveland. The mayor's office wants a statement by morning. This isn't about therapeutic best practices anymore." Maria looked down at Yana, who had returned to her previous silence but continued to watch the adults with that unsettling intensity. The child's small hand remained in hers, and through that contact, Maria felt an echo of the warmth she'd experienced in the fog, a sensation that made her think of Sunday mornings before her world collapsed, when faith had felt as natural as breathing. "What if we're wrong?" The question slipped out before Maria could stop it. "Wrong about what?" Dr. Williams asked. "What if what we saw tonight was real?" Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the lobby had grown so quiet that everyone heard her. What if those 14 dogs didn't go crazy? What if they were protecting her from something we couldn't see? What if that figure in the fog— "Detective," Morrison's voice cut through her words like a blade. I need to see you privately. Now. Maria felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure, the same suffocating certainty that had crushed her during Sophia's investigation. The system didn't want complications. It wanted neat reports, explainable outcomes, and stories that fit within acceptable parameters of possibility. She thought about Officer Martinez's statement, how his hands had shaken as he described the luminous figure that had materialized between the snarling dogs and the terrified child. She thought about her own experience, the warmth, the peace, the momentary dissolution of 3 years' worth of guilt and rage. She thought about the security cameras that had recorded nothing, as if whatever had appeared existed in some space beyond mechanical observation. "Detective Santos?" Dr. Williams's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Maria realized she'd been staring at nothing, lost in the cascade of implications that stretched out before her like a minefield. If she acknowledged what had happened tonight, really acknowledged it, everything would change. Her career, her carefully constructed worldview, her relationship with a grief that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. But if she didn't? Yana tugged gently on her hand, drawing her attention back to those impossibly old eyes. The child mouthed a single word, so quietly that only Maria could choose. Behind them, the lobby continued its controlled chaos. Morrison spoke rapidly into his radio, coordinating with whatever forces were descending on this situation. Dr. Williams made notes on her clipboard, already formulating theories that would transform tonight's events into something manageable. The reporter pressed against the security barrier, her camera operator capturing every moment for the morning news cycle. They all wanted their piece of Yana's story. They all needed it to mean something that served their own purposes: bureaucratic efficiency, professional advancement, ratings, or the simple human desire to witness something larger than themselves. But Maria found herself thinking about Sophia's funeral, about the well-meaning people who had spoken of God's plan and divine purpose. She remembered the rage that had consumed her then, the absolute certainty that no benevolent deity would allow a 13-year-old girl to die afraid and alone in a school bathroom while her mother sat in traffic, helpless and too late. Now, holding the hand of another broken child, Maria faced a choice that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She could step back into the safety of skepticism, or she could leap into something that might save them both, or destroy what little stability she had left. Morrison was walking toward them, his expression brooking no further delays. Maria squeezed Yana's hand and prepared to jump. "Captain Morrison." Maria stood, keeping Yana's hand firmly in hers. "I'm requesting temporary custody of Yana Morales under Section 2151.3, one of the Ohio Revised Code, emergency protective custody for a child witness in an ongoing investigation." The lobby fell silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Morrison's face cycled through surprise, irritation, and something approaching alarm. "Detective Santos, that's highly irregular. CPS has jurisdiction here. Not when the child is a material witness to multiple felonies." Maria's voice carried the steady authority she'd cultivated through 2 decades of police work, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was improvising now, using bureaucratic language to buy time she desperately needed. Yana witnessed her father's murder 8 months ago. Tonight's incident may be related. Separating her from the investigating officer could compromise the integrity of both cases. Dr. Williams frowned. "Maria, I understand your concern, but the child needs specialized care she'll receive." Maria looked directly at Morrison, knowing this moment would define everything that followed. "Under my supervision, with appropriate professional support." She was burning bridges she couldn't rebuild. Morrison's expression made that clear. The captain's radio crackled with urgent voices, coordinators demanding updates on the situation with the girl. Through the windows, the media presence had doubled. Satellite trucks transforming the street into a technological battlefield. But Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: certainty, not the careful, evidence-based certainty of police work, but the bone-deep conviction that had once made Sunday mornings feel like coming home. Looking at Yana, she understood that this child carried something precious and fragile, something that would be dissected, analyzed, and ultimately destroyed by institutional machinery designed to process the explicable. "This is not a request, Detective," Morrison said finally. "It's an order. You will transfer custody of the child to CPS immediately and report to my office for debriefing." The moment crystallized around them. Maria could feel eyes throughout the lobby watching, waiting to see which version of herself would emerge from this crossroads. The obedient detective who followed protocols and filed reports that never quite captured the truth of what she'd witnessed. Or someone else entirely. Yana looked up at her with those impossibly old eyes, and Maria remembered the figure in the fog, the overwhelming sense of peace that had dissolved years of accumulated pain. She thought about Officer Martinez's testimony, about 14 trained police dogs that had become guardians instead of threats, about security cameras that recorded everything except the most important moments. "No," she said quietly. The single word seemed to echo through the lobby. Morrison's face darkened. Dr. Williams stepped forward, her professional concern shifting toward alarm. Even the reporter beyond the security barrier leaned in, sensing the drama unfolding. "Excuse me?" Morrison's voice carried the dangerous quiet of authority challenged. "I said no." Maria's grip on Yana's hand tightened. "This child experienced something extraordinary tonight, something none of us fully understands. I won't let her become a case file or a media spectacle before we know what we're dealing with." She was crossing a line she couldn't uncross, abandoning the safety of institutional protection for something that felt like standing in the middle of a hurricane. But Yana's presence beside her radiated that strange warmth, reminding her of faith she'd thought permanently lost. "Detective Santos," Morrison said, his hand moving toward his radio, "you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." "Captain." Tommy's voice cut through the tension as he emerged from the elevator, his weathered face grim. "We need to talk. All of us." He held up a tablet displaying frozen security footage. "The techs found something you need to see." Morrison hesitated, caught between dealing with Maria's insubordination and addressing whatever Tommy had discovered. In that moment of uncertainty, Maria felt Yana's small hand squeeze hers 3 times, a deliberate pattern that somehow conveyed more than words. Around them, the lobby continued its controlled chaos, but Maria existed now in a different space entirely. She'd stepped across the threshold that separated her old life from whatever came next. There was no going back to the apartment where Sophia's room remained untouched, to case files that never quite filled the emptiness, to the careful routine of surviving rather than living. She'd chosen to believe in something beyond institutional procedures, beyond the explainable boundaries of her profession, beyond the safe skepticism that had protected her from hope's dangerous possibilities. Whatever consequences followed, whatever professional destruction awaited, Maria Santos had finally stopped running from the miraculous and embraced the terrifying freedom of faith. The unknown stretched ahead like an uncharted ocean, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing it alone. Morrison stared at Tommy's tablet, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching fear. The frozen security footage showed the industrial lot from 3 different angles, timestamp reading 9:47 p.m., the exact moment Maria had witnessed the luminous figure. "What am I looking at?" Morrison demanded. Tommy's finger traced the screen. "This is camera 7, facing southeast. You can see Detective Santos approaching the girl, the dogs in formation around the perimeter." He swiped to the next image. "Camera 12, northwest angle, same timestamp." Maria leaned closer, her pulse quickening. The footage showed her moving through the fog, Yana's small silhouette surrounded by the dark shapes of 14 police dogs. Everything looked exactly as she remembered, except for one impossible detail. "There's no fog," she whispered. "That's right." Tommy's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent hours verifying what he was seeing. Crystal clear night on every camera, visibility for miles, But every witness, every single person on scene, described thick fog so dense you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Dr. Williams moved closer, her clinical training warring with curiosity. Mass hallucination is possible under extreme stress, but not with this level of consistency across multiple trained observers. It gets stranger. Tommy swiped to a thermal imaging display. This is from the helicopter's FLIR system, same timestamp. The heat signature image showed human figures scattered around the lot's perimeter, the officers, paramedics, and other personnel. Maria could identify herself approaching the center of the scene, Yana's smaller form registering as a bright spot against the cooler ground. The dogs appeared as moving clusters of warmth. But between Maria and Yana, the thermal image showed something that made no sense, a column of absolutely perfect temperature, neither hot nor cold, shaped roughly like a human figure standing with arms outstretched. "That's impossible," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The FLIR operator ran diagnostics twice," Tommy continued. "Equipment was functioning perfectly, but for approximately 90 seconds the system registered a presence that wasn't there, or rather, was there, but somehow existed outside normal thermal parameters." Maria felt Yana's hand tighten in hers. The child had remained silent since her brief moment of speech, but her presence radiated that strange warmth that reminded Maria of Sunday mornings when faith felt natural. Around them, the lobby had grown quiet, everyone straining to understand the implications of what they were seeing. "There's more." Tommy switched to a different display. Audio analysis from the body cameras picked up something else, a frequency that shouldn't exist. He pressed play, and the speakers filled with the familiar sounds of the emergency response. Radio chatter, barking dogs, shouted instructions. But underneath, almost subliminal, Maria could hear it. A resonance that felt like music without melody, voices without words. "The lab boys say it's acoustic interference," Tommy explained. "Except it's too organized, too structured. It peaks at the exact moments when witnesses reported seeing the apparition." Morrison's radio crackled to life, dispatcher voices cutting through their concentration with urgent updates about media presence and political pressure. But Maria found herself studying the thermal image, remembering the overwhelming sense of peace that had dissolved her pain when the figure appeared. "Captain," a uniform approached from the security desk. "We've got a problem. Channel 7 just went live with cell phone footage from someone across the street. They're calling it a Cleveland miracle." Through the windows, Maria could see the crowd had tripled. News vans formed a semicircle around the building, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Camera lights transformed the evening darkness into artificial day. "Detective Santos." Morrison turned back to her, his earlier anger replaced by something more complex, fear mixed with reluctant curiosity. "In light of this new evidence, I'm suspending your relief from duty. Temporarily. We need to understand what we're dealing with before this situation escalates further." Maria felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was still in the game, but the rules had fundamentally changed. Looking at the thermal image of that impossible presence, she realized they were all navigating uncharted territory now. "There's something else," Tommy said quietly. "I ran background checks on similar incidents. Unexplained phenomena involving children in danger. What I found—" He hesitated, glancing around the lobby. "Maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private." Yana tugged gently on Maria's hand, drawing her attention downward. The child's eyes held that same too-old intensity, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite its whisper. "She says you're ready now." "Ready for what?" Maria asked. "To see what's really happening." The lobby lights flickered, and for just a moment, Maria could swear she smelled roses, the same impossible fragrance that had surrounded the figure in the fog. Around them, conversations faltered as others caught the scent. Whatever was beginning, Maria realized, tonight had been only the first movement in a much larger symphony. The scent of roses lingered for 3 heartbeats before dissipating. leaving the lobby's sterile air feeling suddenly thin and inadequate. Maria watched Morrison's face cycle through confusion and something approaching panic as he looked from the thermal imaging to Yana's two knowing eyes. "Conference room B," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with control. "Now. Santos, bring the girl. Tommy, Williams, you two, everyone else maintains perimeter security. Nothing gets out without my approval." As they moved toward the elevators, Maria felt the weight of watching eyes from every corner of the lobby. Word was spreading through the building's nervous system, uniformed officers speaking in hushed clusters, dispatchers fielding increasingly frantic calls from superiors demanding explanations that didn't exist. The elevator ride stretched in uncomfortable silence. Yana remained pressed against Maria's side, her small hand never releasing its grip. Dr. Williams clutched her tablet, stylus moving frantically across notes that Maria suspected were wholly inadequate for cataloguing what they'd witnessed. Tommy stared at his own screen, the thermal image still glowing with its impossible proof of presence without substance. Conference room B smelled of stale coffee and accumulated stress. Morrison closed the door with deliberate care, the click of the latch sounding final. Through the room's single window, camera lights painted geometric patterns across the ceiling, a reminder of the circus waiting beyond these walls. "Before we go any further," Morrison began, settling into his chair with visible effort, "I need to understand exactly what we're claiming here. Are we seriously discussing supernatural intervention in an active police investigation?" "I'm not claiming anything," Maria said carefully. "I'm reporting what I observed. What we all observed." She gestured toward the tablet displaying the thermal anomaly. "The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence of what, exactly?" Morrison's question carried the desperation of a man watching his orderly world crack along invisible fault lines. Mass hallucination? Equipment malfunction? Some kind of elaborate hoax involving trained police dogs and industrial-grade fog machines? Tommy cleared his throat. "Captain, about those background checks, the similar incidents I mentioned." He opened a different file on his tablet. "I found 17 cases over the past 40 years. Different locations, different circumstances, but always the same pattern. Children in mortal danger, unexplained phenomena, witnesses reporting luminous figures that cameras couldn't capture." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled chaos from the street below. Maria felt something shift in the air around them, as if reality itself was holding its breath. "Show me," Morrison said quietly. Tommy's fingers moved across the screen, pulling up case files that read like fever dreams translated into police reports. A 5-year-old pulled from a burning apartment building in Detroit, witnesses swearing they saw a glowing woman guide the child through smoke-filled corridors that should have been impassable. Twin boys who survived a bridge collapse in Pennsylvania, bystanders reporting a figure in flowing robes who appeared between the falling debris and the children before vanishing as rescue teams arrived. "The documentation is always the same," Tommy continued. "Multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence that something extraordinary occurred, but nothing that definitively proves supernatural intervention, just enough to make investigators question everything they thought they knew about reality." Dr. Williams leaned forward, her clinical training warring with growing fascination. The psychological profile fits a protective archetype that appears across cultures: mother figures, guardian spirits, divine intervention during moments of extreme crisis involving innocence. "You're talking about collective unconscious manifestations," Morrison said, grasping for explanations that didn't require abandoning his worldview entirely. "Shared psychological responses to trauma." "Maybe." Dr. Williams's voice carried doubt. "But that doesn't explain the physical evidence, the thermal readings, the acoustic anomalies, the documented behavioral changes in animals that have no psychological framework for processing archetypal imagery." Maria watched Yana during this exchange, noting how the child's attention seemed divided between the adults' conversation and something else entirely, as if she was listening to voices none of them could hear. The thought sent ice through Maria's chest. "Yana," she said softly. "What do you hear right now?" The girl's eyes focused on Maria with that unsettling intensity. When she spoke, her voice carried the same whispered clarity it had held in the lobby. "She's telling me about the others, the ones who couldn't be saved." Jana's gaze shifted to the window where camera lights continued their electronic vigil. "She says people will try to make this about themselves, but it's not about them. It's about what's coming." "What's coming?" Morrison demanded, his professional skepticism cracking under the weight of accumulating impossibilities. Before Jana could answer, Tommy's phone buzzed with an incoming message. His face went pale as he read the screen. "Captain," he said, his voice barely steady, "we've got another situation. Emergency call just came in from Riverside Elementary. Teachers reporting strange animal behavior on the playground. Dogs from the neighborhood gathering around the school, forming some kind of protective perimeter around the children." The room erupted into motion. Morrison reaching for his radio, Dr. Williams gathering her materials, Tommy pulling up GPS coordinates. But Maria remained frozen, understanding with crystalline clarity that tonight had been preparation for something larger. Jana's small hand squeezed hers 3 times, and Maria felt that familiar warmth spreading up her arm like benediction. "It's starting," the child whispered, "and you're the only one who can help them understand." The conference room exploded into chaos as Morrison barked orders into his radio, but Maria remained anchored to her chair by Jana's words. "You're the only one who can help them understand." The weight of that responsibility crashed over her like a physical blow, dredging up every moment of helplessness from 3 years ago when she'd failed to save Sophia. "Santos, move," Morrison commanded, but Maria found herself paralyzed by the terrible symmetry of it all. Another school, other children, the same crushing responsibility she'd carried since that October morning when her daughter's laughter had been silenced forever. Jana's grip tightened, and suddenly Maria was standing in that blood-soaked hallway again, hearing the echoes of gunshots and her own voice screaming Sophia's name. The familiar panic clawed at her chest, the crushing certainty that she would fail, that whatever was happening at Riverside Elementary would end with more small bodies, more grieving parents, more questions about why God allowed innocents to suffer. "I can't," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "I couldn't save my own daughter. How can I possibly help anyone else's children?" The room fell silent except for Morrison's radio crackling with updates from Riverside Elementary. 12 dogs now, forming in perfect circle around the playground equipment. Children inside the building, pressed against windows, watching with the same too knowing expression Maria recognized in Jana's eyes. "Because this time you're not alone," Jana said, her voice cutting through Maria's spiral with startling clarity. "She's been waiting for you to stop running." Tommy's tablet chimed with an incoming video feed from the scene. The security camera at Riverside showed exactly what the radio reports described. A dozen neighborhood dogs sitting in formation around the empty playground, their heads turned outward as if watching for threats that hadn't yet materialized. But more unsettling were the children visible through the school's windows, all facing the same direction, all perfectly still. "Maria." Dr. Williams's voice carried professional concern mixed with something else. Understanding, perhaps. "Whatever happened to your daughter, whatever guilt you're carrying, it doesn't disqualify you from helping these children. Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest strengths." But Maria was drowning in the memory of Sophia's final moments, the way her daughter's hand had gone slack in hers, the terrible silence that followed the chaos. She'd become a crisis negotiator to save children, and when it mattered most, she'd failed completely. Morrison's radio erupted with static, then a voice Maria didn't recognize. "Captain, we've got a situation developing. The children at Riverside, they're not responding to teachers, just standing at the windows, perfectly synchronized. And, sir, they're all humming the same melody." The thermal image on Tommy's tablet flickered, showing heat signatures that defied explanation. The dogs registered normally, but between them and the school building, columns of that same impossible temperature appeared, neither hot nor cold, shaped like figures standing in protective formation. "It's happening again," Morrison said, his voice hollow with the realization that tonight had shattered every assumption about the nature of reality. Whatever occurred in that industrial lot, it's spreading. Maria felt the room spinning around her, past and present colliding with devastating force. She could smell gunpowder, mixed with roses, hear Sophia's laughter beneath the radio's urgent chatter. The weight of failure pressed down on her like a physical thing, threatening to crush whatever remained of her faith. Then Jana stood and placed both small hands on Maria's face, forcing their eyes to meet. When the child spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Maria's bones. She says you've been carrying the wrong burden. Your daughter's death wasn't your failure. It was her victory. She chose love over fear, even knowing the cost. Just like you have to choose now. The scent of roses filled the conference room, impossible and overwhelming. Around them, the fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like communication. Morrison's radio fell silent, Tommy's tablet screen went white, and Dr. Williams's pen stopped moving across her notes. In that suspended moment, Maria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, the locked door she'd built around her heart 3 years ago finally creaking open. Sophia's death hadn't been punishment for her inadequacy as a mother or protector. It had been a demonstration of the kind of love that transcends mortality, the same love that had materialized in the fog to shield Jana from harm. "The children at Riverside," Maria said, her voice steadying as understanding dawned. "They're not in danger. They're being prepared." "Prepared for what?" Morrison demanded. Maria stood, Jana's warm hand sliding back into hers like a key finding its lock. Through the conference room window, she could see the media circus below, but beyond the lights and chaos, something larger was stirring. The same presence that had appeared in the industrial lot was gathering strength, manifesting wherever innocence faced peril. "For what comes next," Maria said, finally ready to embrace whatever that might mean. The moment those words left Maria's lips, Morrison's radio exploded with an urgent transmission that shattered the rose-scented stillness. "All units, code red, at Riverside Elementary. We've lost contact with teaching staff. Children are..." Jesus Christ, they're walking out of the building in formation. "Repeat, 73 children walking across the playground toward the perimeter dogs." Maria's blood turned to ice. Through the conference room window, she could see emergency vehicles screaming toward the distant glow of Riverside's location, their sirens creating a symphony of approaching disaster. The understanding that had felt so certain moments before crumbled like sand between her fingers. "No," she breathed, grabbing for Tommy's tablet. The thermal feed showed exactly what the radio described, small heat signatures moving in perfect synchronization across the playground, converging on the circle of dogs whose body language had shifted from protective to agitated. Morrison was shouting orders, coordinating response teams, but his voice seemed to come from underwater. Maria felt the familiar paralysis creeping up her spine, the same helpless terror that had consumed her during Sophia's final moments. She'd thought she understood what was happening, believed she was finally ready to embrace whatever divine intervention was manifesting around them. She'd been catastrophically wrong. "We have to get there," she said, already moving toward the door, but Morrison's hand caught her arm. "Santos, you're not cleared for field response." "Dr. Williams, what the hell could cause this kind of mass behavioral anomaly in children?" Psychologist stared at her tablet, her clinical composure fracturing. "Nothing in the literature. Mass hysteria doesn't work this way. Children don't synchronize like this without external stimulus, and even then..." "Captain," Tommy interrupted, his face ashen as new data streamed across his screen. "The dogs aren't protecting the children anymore. Their stress indicators are spiking. Whatever's happening, they're as confused as we are." The radio crackled again. "We've got parents arriving on scene. They're trying to breach the perimeter. Sir, these kids aren't responding to their own families. They're just standing there, staring at something none of us can see." Maria's chest constricted as the terrible possibility crystallized. What if the apparition hadn't been protection at all, but predation? What if she'd misinterpreted everything? seen divine intervention where something far more sinister was actually unfolding. The same crushing doubt that had haunted her since Sophia's death came roaring back with renewed venom. Yana, she turned to the child desperately. What's happening to them? What's happening to those children? But Yana's face had gone pale, her earlier certainty replaced by something that looked almost like fear. I can't hear her anymore. She's gone quiet. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. If even Yana was losing connection with whatever force had seemed to offer salvation, then everything was falling apart. The children at Riverside weren't being prepared for something beautiful. They were being led into danger, and Maria had convinced herself to see miracles instead of threats. Morrison's radio delivered the final devastating update. Captain, we've got a problem. The children have stopped at the fence line, but they're not coming back. And sir, we're detecting gas leaks from the construction site adjacent to the school. If those kids don't move soon... The conference room fell silent, except for the sound of Maria's world collapsing. Through her desperate need to believe in redemption, she'd misread every sign, ignored every warning. Just like 3 years ago, when she'd convinced herself that love and faith would be enough to save Sophia from a gunman's bullet. I have to go, she said, pushing past Morrison toward the door. I have to... You have to stay here. Morrison's voice carried the finality of absolute authority. Santos, you're emotionally compromised. I'm pulling you from this case entirely. Dr. Williams will handle any further interaction with the Morales girl. The words struck her like a death sentence. After everything, the miraculous intervention in the fog, the impossible thermal readings, the growing certainty that she was meant to be part of something larger, she was being benched again, relegated to the sidelines while other people's children faced mortal peril. Captain, please. Detective Santos, you're relieved of duty pending psychological evaluation. Turn in your weapon and badge. Maria looked at Yana, searching for some sign that the divine presence was still there, still offering guidance. But the child's eyes held only confusion and fear, the same mortal terror that belonged in a 7-year-old who had already witnessed too much death. The roses were gone, the impossible warmth had faded, and 73 children stood motionless on a playground above a gas leak, while Maria, the woman who had thought herself chosen for redemption, was being escorted from the building like a common liability. As Tommy gently took her badge and service weapon, Maria realized with devastating clarity that some wounds never heal. Some failures can't be redeemed, and sometimes believing in miracles only makes the inevitable tragedy more crushing when it finally arrives. Through the window, emergency lights painted the darkness red as her second chance at salvation slipped away into the night. The elevator doors closed like a tomb sealing shut, trapping Maria in a steel box with her shattered faith and Tommy's sympathetic silence. As they descended toward the parking garage, she caught a reflection in the polished metal, a hollow-eyed woman who'd confused desperation for divine calling, trauma for transcendence. This isn't right, Tommy said quietly, his voice barely audible over the elevator's mechanical hum. What you experienced with Yana, what we all witnessed, that wasn't delusion. Maria laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the confined walls. Wasn't it? A grieving mother sees what she needs to see. Classic textbook case. But even as the words left her mouth, something nagged at her consciousness, a detail that didn't fit the neat psychological explanation Morrison and Dr. Williams were constructing around her breakdown. The elevator shuddered to a stop, doors opening onto the garage's fluorescent-lit cavern. Maria stepped out, feeling the weight of her civilian status like a physical burden. No badge, no authority, no way to help those children at Riverside Elementary who were... She stopped walking so abruptly that Tommy nearly collided with her. The thermal readings, she said, her mind racing. Tommy, the thermal readings from tonight and from the industrial lot. What did they show? Tommy frowned, pulling out his tablet despite the breach of protocol. Temperature anomalies. Figures that registered neither hot nor cold, like they existed outside normal thermodynamic. No, Maria interrupted. pieces clicking together with devastating clarity, not what they showed, what they didn't show. Yana was surrounded by 14 aggressive K9 units, remember? Snarling, ready to attack. But when we reviewed the footage, when we analyzed the data, where was her fear response? Tommy's fingers moved across the screen, pulling up archived thermal images from the industrial lot. There was Yana's small heat signature, surrounded by the dog's agitated red forms and those impossible cool columns that had appeared between them. But Yana's thermal pattern showed none of the elevated temperature that should accompany terror. Instead, her body heat remained steady, consistent, calm. 7-year-old children don't maintain normal body temperature when facing mortal danger, Maria continued, her voice gaining strength as the revelation crystallized. Fight or flight response is involuntary. Unless she knew she was safe, Tommy finished, understanding dawning across his features. Unless she could see something we couldn't that told her protection was already there. The garage around them seemed to fade as Maria felt the final piece of the puzzle slide into place. Not divine intervention appearing in response to danger, divine intervention arriving first, positioning itself before the threat materialized. The dogs hadn't been drawn to Yana by some mysterious force. They'd been responding to something that was already there, already shielding her. The children at Riverside, she breathed. They're not being led into danger. They're being moved away from it. Tommy's tablet chimed with an incoming update from the scene. His face went white as he read the latest report. Maria, they're saying the gas leak is worse than initially reported. Underground pockets throughout the school's foundation. The entire building. He looked up at her with stricken eyes. If those children had stayed inside, the truth hit her like a physical blow, reorganizing everything she thought she understood about the evening's events. The luminous figure hadn't appeared to save Yana from the dogs. She'd appeared to guide the dogs to Yana, marking her as protected, chosen for something larger. The same presence had manifested at Riverside not to lead children into peril, but to lead them out of it before anyone else recognized the threat. She's not responding to crises, Maria whispered. She's preventing them. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. With shaking hands, she opened the message to find a single line, the chapel basement. Come alone. Tommy glimpsed the screen. That's not possible. This building doesn't have a chapel. But Maria was already moving, following an instinct that cut through her rational mind like a blade through silk. She'd been wrong about everything, her role, the nature of what was happening, the meaning of her own daughter's death. But she wasn't wrong about this pull, this certainty that drew her toward the building's deeper levels. The basement access required a security card she no longer possessed, but the door stood ajar when she reached it, as if someone had been expecting her arrival. Emergency lighting cast everything in amber shadow as she descended stairs that shouldn't have existed, following a path that architectural plans would never have recorded. The chapel was small, perhaps a dozen pews facing a simple altar where candles flickered with impossible steadiness. And there, kneeling in the front row with her back to the entrance, was a figure Maria recognized from every religious painting she'd ever seen, every prayer she'd ever whispered in desperate moments when faith seemed impossible. "Hello, Maria," the Virgin Mary said without turning around, her voice carrying the weight of eternity and the gentleness of morning light. "We have much to discuss about your daughter's true purpose, and yours." Maria's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she gripped the back of the nearest pew to steady herself. The wood felt warm beneath her palms, radiating a comfort that seemed to seep into her bones. After a lifetime of questioning, of wondering if faith was just elaborate self-deception, here was the answer sitting 3 feet away in flowing blue robes. "My daughter is dead," Maria whispered, her voice cracking on the words that had defined her existence for 3 years. "Sophia died because I couldn't save her." The Virgin Mary turned then, and Maria found herself looking into eyes that held the depth of every mother's love and every mother's grief. The face was neither young nor old, neither any single ethnicity, nor somehow transcending them all. It was simply the face of perfect understanding. Sophia died because she chose to shield 3 classmates from gunfire, the Virgin replied, rising gracefully from her kneeling position. She died because at 7 years old, she possessed the same courage that brought you to this basement tonight, despite every rational reason to stay away. Maria felt tears streaming down her cheeks, hot against her skin in the chapel's cool air. I failed her. I was supposed to protect her, and I failed. You gave her something far more valuable than protection, Maria. You gave her the capacity for selfless love, the same gift that allowed her to see past her own fear in those final moments. The Virgin moved closer, her presence filling the small space with an almost tangible warmth. Do you think it was coincidence that brought you to Yana Morales tonight? The question hit Maria like a revelation. In her grief and guilt, she'd never considered that her path might intersect with Yana's for reasons beyond random assignment. Sophia, she led me there? She and others like her, children who chose love over fear, even knowing the cost. They become part of something larger, Maria, guardians who watch over the innocent, who guide protection where it's needed most. The Virgin's voice carried harmonics that resonated in Maria's chest, unlocking chambers of her heart that had been sealed since that terrible day 3 years ago. Maria sank into the front pew, her mind reeling as understanding flooded through her. The dogs at the industrial lot, the children at Riverside. Sophia was there? She was there. She is here now. The Virgin settled beside Maria with a rustling of robes that sounded like wind through olive trees. But you must understand, Maria, that this gift comes with responsibility. What you witnessed tonight was not an ending, but a beginning. Yana is not the only child who will need protection in the days ahead. The weight of those words settled over Maria like a mantle. She thought of Morrison stripping away her badge and weapon, of being dismissed as emotionally compromised, of watching helplessly as other people's children faced danger. How can I protect anyone? I don't even have authority to— Authority comes in many forms, the Virgin interrupted gently. The authority of love, the authority of understanding, the authority of having walked through darkness and chosen to seek light. She placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, and warmth spread through her entire body. Morrison was wrong to remove you from this case. You are not emotionally compromised, you are emotionally awakened. Maria felt something fundamental shifting inside her chest, like tectonic plates finding new alignment after years of grinding tension. The guilt that had driven her for 3 years wasn't disappearing, but it was transforming into something else. Purpose, determination, the quiet strength that comes from accepting rather than fighting divine will. What happens now? She asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Now you choose. You can return to the life you knew before tonight, carrying the knowledge of what you've experienced as either comfort or burden. Or you can accept that Sophia's death was not your failure to prevent, but her choice to exemplify, and let that understanding guide you toward the work you were always meant to do. The candles on the altar flickered in unison, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Maria could hear sirens in the distance, emergency responders still dealing with the aftermath at Riverside Elementary. Yana was somewhere upstairs, probably frightened and confused by the evening's chaos. Children throughout the city slept unaware of the invisible forces that watched over them. Yana needs an advocate, the Virgin continued. Someone who understands what she's experiencing, who can protect her from those who would exploit or silence her gift. More importantly, there are other children like her, sensitive ones who can perceive what adults have trained themselves to ignore. Maria wiped her tears away, feeling purpose crystallizing with each word. Morrison had stripped away her official authority, but he couldn't remove her from the case that mattered most. How do I find them? The Virgin smiled, and the expression transformed the entire chapel with its radiance. The same way Sophia found you tonight, Maria. The same way you found this basement that doesn't officially exist. Trust the pull in your chest. Follow the scent of roses. Listen for the voices that speak without words. Maria stood, feeling stronger than she had in 3 years. The weight of Sophia's death would always be with her, but now it felt like armor rather than anchor. I understand. The Virgin Mary's smile lingered like an echo as she began to fade, her luminous form dissolving into motes of light that danced briefly around the chapel before vanishing. Maria found herself alone with the flickering candles and the profound certainty that her real work was just beginning. She climbed the basement stairs 2 at a time, her footsteps echoing with newfound purpose. The security door that had mysteriously opened for her descent now stood firmly locked, as if the chapel had never existed at all. But Maria carried its warmth in her chest like a coal that would never burn out. The elevator ride to the main floor felt different now, not a descent into powerlessness, but an ascent toward action. She had no badge, no weapon, no official standing, but she had something far more valuable, absolute clarity about what needed to be done. Tommy was waiting by the reception desk, his face creased with worry. "Maria, thank God. Morrison's been looking for you. The situation at Riverside is resolved," Maria finished, checking her phone. The emergency alerts had stopped. The last update showed all 73 children safely evacuated and the gas leak contained before it could reach critical levels. "The children are safe." "How did you—" Tommy began, then stopped himself. After everything they'd witnessed tonight, perhaps some questions didn't require rational answers. "Morrison wants to see you in his office." "Now." Maria nodded, feeling the pull in her chest that the Virgin had described. Not toward Morrison's office, but toward something else entirely. Through the station's main windows, she could see news vans gathering like vultures. By morning, Jana's story would be splashed across every screen and newspaper in the country. The girl would need protection from more than just aggressive dogs. "Tell Morrison I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said, then headed for the stairs that led to the family services wing, where Jana was being kept under protective custody. The hallway was quieter than she'd expected, just one uniformed officer stationed outside the consultation room. Maria approached with the confidence of someone who still belonged here, who had every right to check on a traumatized child in their care. "Detective Santos," the officer nodded respectfully. He was young, probably hadn't heard about her suspension yet. "How is she?" Maria asked, peering through the small window into the room where Jana sat coloring at a small table. "Quiet. Won't talk to the counselor they brought in. Keeps asking for you, though." Maria's heart clenched. Through the glass, she watched Jana carefully select each crayon, her small hands moving with deliberate precision across the paper. The drawing was taking shape, a figure in flowing robes surrounded by smaller forms that might have been children or dogs or both. "I need 5 minutes with her," Maria said. The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm supposed to check with—" "5 minutes," Maria repeated, and something in her voice, perhaps an echo of divine authority, made him step aside. Jana looked up as Maria entered, her dark eyes brightening with relief. "You came back." "I promised I would." Maria knelt beside the table, studying the drawing. Up close, she could see details that made her breath catch. Tiny wings on some of the figures, faces that seemed familiar despite being rendered in children's crayon strokes. "Who are they?" "The helpers," Jana said simply. "They're always there, but most grown-ups can't see them anymore. They get too busy looking at other things." Maria understood completely. She thought of crime scenes and reports and rational explanations, all the things that had trained her to ignore the impossible. "Jana, there are people who are going to want to talk to you about what happened tonight. They might not understand about the helpers." The girl nodded gravely, adding more blue to one of the robed figures. "I know. She told me you'd help keep me safe from the ones who don't believe." "She?" Jana looked at Maria with the patient expression of a child explaining something obvious to a slow adult. "Your little girl, Sophia. She says you're ready now." The words hit Maria like a physical force, confirming what she'd known in her heart since leaving the chapel. This wasn't about solving one case or saving one child. This was about accepting a calling that had been waiting for her since the moment Sophia chose to shield her classmates with her own small body. Heavy footsteps in the hallway announced Morrison's approach. Maria could hear him arguing with the officer outside, demanding to know why protocol had been breached. In moments, he would storm through that door with his anger and his dismissals and his complete inability to comprehend what was actually happening here. Maria stood, placing a gentle hand on Jana's shoulder. "I have to go talk to some people now. But I want you to remember something. You're not alone in this. You're never alone." Morrison burst through the door just as Maria turned to face him, and she saw the confrontation in his eyes that would determine everything that came next. "Santos, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Morrison's voice carried the full weight of his authority, but Maria found herself unmoved by the fury radiating from his stocky frame. Behind him, she could see Tommy hovering in the doorway, his face a mask of worried anticipation. Checking on a traumatized child, Maria replied evenly, not stepping away from Jana's table. "Something we should all be doing right now, instead of treating her like a case file." Morrison's jaw worked silently for a moment, his gaze flicking between Maria and the little girl who continued, coloring, as if the confrontation wasn't happening. "You were suspended, Detective. You have no business being anywhere near this case or this child." "Funny thing about that," Maria said, feeling the warmth from the chapel still coursing through her veins like liquid courage. "I've been thinking about your concerns regarding my emotional fitness for duty. You might be right. I am emotionally compromised. But not in the way you think." She moved closer to Morrison, close enough to see the network of broken blood vessels across his nose, the stress lines carved deep around his eyes. Here was a man who had spent decades building walls between himself and the incomprehensible, who had made a career of reducing mystery to paperwork. "For 3 years, I've been running from the fact that my daughter died a hero. I've been so focused on my failure to save her that I missed the truth. Sophia didn't need saving. She was doing the saving." Maria's voice gained strength with each word, carrying harmonics of the certainty that had filled her in the chapel. "And tonight, I finally understood what that means." Morrison's face darkened. "Santos, if you think some kind of religious experience is going to— 73 children are alive tonight because a presence guided them away from a gas leak that could have killed them all," Maria interrupted, her voice cutting through his dismissal like a blade. "Jana Morales is safe because something stepped between her and 14 aggressive K9 units. These aren't coincidences, Captain. They're not mass hallucinations, they're interventions." Behind Morrison, Tommy shifted uncomfortably. Maria could see the conflict in the younger detective's face, his rational training warring with everything he'd witnessed firsthand tonight. "You want to know what really happened in that basement?" Morrison snarled. "You had a breakdown. Stress-induced hallucination brought on by unresolved trauma. It happens to cops who don't deal with their psychological—" "No." The word came from Jana, spoken so quietly that everyone in the room had to strain to hear it. The little girl had stopped coloring and was looking directly at Morrison with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7-year-old face. She saw her, they all did. The lady in blue who keeps us safe. Morrison's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. In all his years of police work, all his experience with traumatized children, he had never heard Jana speak before tonight. According to her file, she hadn't said a word since witnessing her father's murder 6 months ago. Maria knelt beside Jana's chair, understanding flooding through her as she looked at the drawing spread across the table. It wasn't just random figures in robes, it was a map. Each colored form represented a location, a moment of intervention, a child who had been protected by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. "How many?" Maria asked softly. Jana's small finger traced across the paper, touching each figure in turn. "Lots, but more coming. She says the dark ones are getting stronger, so the helpers have to work harder." The words sent a chill down Maria's spine that had nothing to do with the station's air conditioning. She thought of Morrison's files, the cases that had been dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. How many other children like Jana were out there, bearing witness to interventions that adults refused to acknowledge? Captain Maria stood and faced Morrison with the full weight of her newfound purpose. "You can keep me suspended. You can strip away my badge and my weapon and my official authority. But you cannot remove me from this case, because this case was never really about police work. Morrison's face had gone pale, his usual bluster deflated by Yana's unexpected words. "Santos, you're talking about—" "I'm talking about accepting responsibility for something larger than departmental protocol," Maria said. "Yana needs protection from people who would exploit her gift or silence her testimony. There are other children out there who need the same protection, and there are forces at work in this city that require someone who understands what they're actually dealing with." She could feel Tommy watching her, could sense the moment when his skepticism began to crack under the weight of accumulated, impossible evidence. Even Morrison seemed shaken, his bureaucratic certainty wavering as he looked between the speaking child and the suspended detective, who radiated unshakable conviction. "You're asking me to believe in miracles," Morrison said finally. Maria smiled, feeling Sophia's presence like sunlight on her shoulders. "I'm asking you to get out of my way while I do what I should have been doing all along." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Morrison's face cycled through emotions, disbelief, anger, something that might have been fear. Tommy stood frozen in the doorway, one hand resting unconsciously on his service weapon as if the confrontation might turn physical. Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing the room in hellish red that made everyone's faces look like masks carved from shadow. But in that moment of absolute darkness, Maria felt something she had never experienced before, a cold so profound it seemed to leach the warmth from her bones, a presence that was the antithesis of everything she'd encountered in the chapel. Yana whimpered, her small hand finding Maria's with desperate urgency. "They're here," the child whispered. "The dark ones. They don't want me to tell." Through the consultation room's window, Maria could see chaos erupting throughout the station. Officers were shouting, their voices carrying notes of panic that spoke to something far beyond a simple power outage. The emergency lighting flickered erratically, as if whatever force had invaded the building was feeding on the electrical systems themselves. Morrison was barking orders into his radio, demanding status reports from units that weren't responding. But Maria's attention was fixed on Yana, whose small body had begun to tremble with a terror that went bone deep. "Detective Santos." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. When Maria turned toward the sound, she saw a figure materializing in the corner of the room, not the luminous presence she'd encountered in the chapel, but something that made her soul recoil. It wore the shape of a man in an expensive suit, but the edges kept shifting like smoke, and where its eyes should have been were voids that seemed to pull at the light around them. Morrison and Tommy showed no sign of seeing it, but Yana pressed closer to Maria with a gasp of recognition. "You've interfered enough," the thing said, its voice carrying undertones that made Maria's teeth ache. "The child will be silent. The witnesses will be discredited. The old ways will be forgotten." Maria stepped protectively in front of Yana, every instinct screaming at her to run. But beneath the terror, she felt something else rising, the same warmth that had filled her in the chapel, the presence of her daughter standing beside her like a shield of love made manifest. "No," Maria said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "She won't be silenced. None of them will be." The shadow figure laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "What can you possibly do, detective? You have no badge, no authority, no power, except what your broken mind believes it has seen." As if summoned by the creature's words, Morrison spun around, his face twisted with desperate anger. The power outage, the chaos in the station, Yana's impossible testimony, it was all too much for his rational mind to process. He needed someone to blame, something concrete to fight against. "Enough," Morrison shouted, lunging toward Maria. "I don't know what kind of breakdown you're having, Santos, but it ends now. You're under psychiatric evaluation until—" Tommy moved to intercept his captain, but the shadow creature gestured with one impossible hand, and suddenly the younger detective was stumbling backward as if struck by an invisible force. He crashed into the wall and slid down, his eyes rolling back in his head. Yana screamed, a sound of pure terror that seemed to pierce the veil between worlds. In response, the emergency lighting blazed brighter, so bright it hurt to look at. and Maria felt a familiar presence rushing toward them like a wind carrying the scent of roses. The Virgin Mary materialized between Maria and the shadow creature, her robes flowing with light that made the emergency strobes look dim by comparison. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood other figures, children with faces Maria almost recognized, adults whose clothing spanned centuries, all of them radiating the same protective love that had calmed the dogs and guided the children away from danger. Sophia was among them. "You have no power here," the Virgin said to the shadow creature, her voice carrying the authority of love that had endured since the beginning of time. "These children are protected. This woman is protected. Your influence ends now." The creature snarled, revealing teeth like broken obsidian. "The world belongs to us now. Faith dies a little more each day. Soon there will be no one left who believes." "Then we will remind them," Maria said, stepping forward despite every survival instinct telling her to cower. She reached out and took Jana's hand, feeling the child's small fingers intertwine with hers. "We'll remind them that love is stronger than fear, that miracles happen when people choose to see them, that children like Sophia and Jana are worth protecting, worth believing in." The shadow creature's form began to waver, its edges dissolving like smoke in sunlight. But its voice lingered as it faded. "This isn't over, detective. We know where to find you now." Then it was gone, taking the oppressive cold with it. The emergency lighting steadied, casting the consultation room in a warm amber glow that seemed almost golden after the harsh red strobes. Tommy groaned from where he'd fallen against the wall, his eyes fluttering open with confusion. Morrison stood frozen, his mouth agape, staring at the space where impossible figures had just vanished like morning mist. But Maria felt their presence still, Sophia's love wrapping around her heart like arms she would never hold again. The Virgin's voice echoing with words that would change everything. "The choice is yours, beloved daughter. But know that accepting this calling means leaving behind the life you knew." Jana's small hand squeezed hers with surprising strength. "She's asking you to choose," the child whispered, her dark eyes reflecting depths of understanding no 7-year-old should possess. "The helpers need someone who can walk between the worlds, someone the grown-ups will listen to." Maria understood, the warmth in her chest. Sophia's presence, the Virgin's blessing, came with a price. To truly protect children like Jana, to stand as a guardian against the shadow creatures that fed on despair and doubt, she would have to surrender everything that had once defined her. Her badge, her career, her carefully constructed rational worldview, all of it would have to burn away like dross to reveal what lay beneath. "Santos!" Morrison's voice cracked like breaking ice. His face had aged years in minutes, the comfortable certainties of his ordered universe crumbling around him. What did I just see?" Before Maria could answer, her phone buzzed with an alert. Another emergency, this time at Lincoln Elementary, where witnesses reported a maintenance worker with a gun approaching the playground. But underneath the official notification, she felt something else, a pull in her chest, urgent and undeniable, calling her toward children in mortal danger. "Tommy, get up," she said, moving toward the door with Jana still clinging to her hand. "There's another situation developing." "Maria, wait." Tommy struggled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "I saw them too, all of them. I know how insane that sounds, but—" "It doesn't sound insane anymore," Morrison interrupted, his voice hollow. He was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "God help me, it doesn't sound insane at all." Maria felt the moment crystallizing around her like fate made manifest. She could walk out of this room and continue pretending to be Detective Santos, could cling to the fragments of her old life and hope the visions would fade. Or she could accept what Sophia and the Virgin had been trying to show her all along, that some battles required warriors who operated beyond the boundaries of badges and jurisdiction. "Captain," she said, turning to face Morrison with absolute clarity, "I'm resigning from the force." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Tommy's eyes widened with shock. but Morrison just nodded slowly as if he'd been expecting this moment since the first K9 unit had gone aggressive 3 days ago. "The pension, your benefits, everything you've worked for," Tommy started, "means nothing if children are dying while I fill out forms and follow protocol," Maria finished. She pulled her badge from her jacket pocket, the metal warm against her palm like a living thing reluctant to let go. Beside it, her service weapon felt suddenly heavy, a burden she no longer needed to carry. "There's something happening in this city, something that requires protection beyond what any police department can provide," she continued, placing both badge and weapon on Yana's coloring table. "Children are seeing things, experiencing interventions that adults dismiss or ignore. They need someone who believes in them, who can stand between them and forces that want to silence their voices forever." Yana looked up at her with eyes that held galaxies of trust. "Will you still keep me safe?" "Always," Maria promised, feeling Sophia's approval wash through her like sunlight, but not as Detective Santos, as something new. Her phone buzzed again. Lincoln Elementary, children screaming, sirens converging, but now she felt the pull differently. Not as a cop responding to a call, but as something else entirely, a guardian, a protector, someone who could see miracles and call them by their true names. "The Virgin told me I would have to sacrifice what I treasured most," Maria said, looking at the badge that had defined her identity for 15 years. "I thought she meant my life, my safety, but she meant this, who I used to be." Morrison picked up her badge with trembling fingers, his face a battlefield between skepticism and the evidence of his own senses. "What happens now?" I go save some children," Maria said simply. "And you decide whether you're going to help me or spend the rest of your career explaining why impossible things keep happening on your watch." She walked toward the door with Yana's hand in hers, feeling lighter with each step. Behind them, Tommy was already reaching for his keys, his loyalty stronger than his confusion. Even Morrison was moving, his cop instincts overriding his shattered worldview. The old Maria Santos was gone. What walked into the night was something new, a guardian angel with calloused hands and unshakable faith. The drive to Lincoln Elementary passed in surreal calm. Maria sat in the passenger seat of Tommy's unmarked car, watching the familiar streets of East Cleveland blur past while Yana dozed against her shoulder. The radio crackled with updates from units converging on the school, but the words seemed to come from a great distance, as if she were listening to someone else's emergency. "Units in position. Suspect is a 43-year-old maintenance worker terminated last week. Witnesses report he's armed with a handgun and approaching the playground where approximately 30 children are present." Tommy's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Maria, what if we're too late? What if this time—" "We won't be," she said with quiet certainty that surprised them both. The warmth in her chest pulsed gently, Sophia's presence as constant as her own heartbeat. "This isn't about arriving in time anymore. It's about being where we're meant to be." Morrison's voice crackled over the radio from the command post he'd established 2 blocks from the school. Despite his shattered worldview, the captain was still a cop, still capable of coordinating a crisis response, even when that crisis defied everything he thought he knew about reality. "All units hold position. Do not approach the suspect. Repeat, do not engage." Tommy shot Maria a questioning look. She nodded, understanding without words that Morrison was buying them time, creating space for whatever was about to unfold. They arrived to find the school surrounded by police cars, their red and blue lights painting the brick facade in strobing colors that reminded Maria uncomfortably of the emergency lighting at the station. Beyond the perimeter, she could see the playground where a lone figure stood among the swing sets, children scattered like frightened birds across the asphalt. But as they approached the command post, Maria felt something shift in the air, a familiar electricity that made her skin tingle and Yana stir in her arms. "He's not here to hurt them," the little girl whispered, her eyes still closed but her voice carrying that otherworldly certainty that had become familiar. "He's scared. The Dark Ones are whispering to him, making him think terrible things." Maria looked through the chain-link fence at the man standing among the playground equipment. From this distance, she could see his shoulders shaking, could make out the gun hanging loose in his hand, as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. His free hand was pressed against his ear, as though trying to block out sounds only he could hear. "Morrison," she called as they reached the command post. The captain turned toward them, his face haggard but determined. "You need to let me through." "Santos, you're not even—" "I'm not a cop anymore," she agreed. "But I'm the only one here who can see what's really happening to him." She handed Yana gently to Tommy, who accepted the child with the careful reverence of someone holding something precious and fragile. Then she walked toward the fence line, feeling eyes tracking her movement, not just from the officers behind her, but from presences she couldn't see but knew were gathering. The maintenance worker looked up as she approached, and Maria's breath caught. His eyes held the same hollow darkness she'd seen in the shadow creature at the station, but underneath the void was something else: pain, confusion, a soul being torn apart by whispers that promised relief through violence. "I know you can hear them," Maria called out, her voice carrying clearly across the playground. "I know they're telling you that hurting these children will make the pain stop." The man's gun hand twitched, but he didn't raise the weapon. Around the playground's perimeter, the scattered children had gone eerily still, their faces turned toward something Maria couldn't quite see. Figures, in flowing robes materializing like morning fog among the jungle gyms and monkey bars. "They're lying," Maria continued, stepping closer to the fence. "The pain won't stop. It will just spread to everyone who loves these children, everyone who has to live with what happens here. You don't want that burden." Behind her, she heard Morrison barking orders to his snipers to stand down, felt Tommy's tension like a physical force. But Maria's attention was fixed on the man before her, on the battle being waged in his eyes between shadow and light. "My name is Maria," she said, her voice gentler now. "I lost my daughter 3 years ago. I know what it feels like when the whispers tell you that other people's children don't deserve to live when yours can't." The gun slipped from his fingers, hitting the asphalt with a sound like a prayer answered. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing with the desperate relief of a man who had just stepped back from an abyss he couldn't have survived crossing. Around the playground, the luminous figures began to fade, but not before Maria caught a glimpse of Sophia standing beside a swing set, her 8-year-old face radiant with pride and love. The immediate crisis was over, but Maria knew this was just the beginning. Somewhere in the city, other battles waited, other children who needed protection, other souls being torn between light and shadow. She was ready. The paramedics led the broken maintenance worker away in restraints that seemed unnecessary. His fight had crumbled the moment the gun left his hands, leaving behind only a hollow-eyed man who kept whispering apologies to children who had already forgiven him without words. Maria watched from behind the fence as parents arrived to collect their sons and daughters, each reunion a small miracle of relief and gratitude. "Santos." Morrison appeared beside her, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. "We need to talk about what happens next." She turned to find her former captain studying her with eyes that had seen too much in the past 3 days. Behind him stood Tommy, with Yana still in his arms, the little girl's dark gaze fixed on the playground where ghostly figures had materialized to protect the innocent. "There's going to be paperwork," Morrison continued, running a hand through his graying hair. "Reports, investigations, questions about how you knew exactly what to say to defuse the situation. Questions about why every crisis involving children in this city seems to have you at the center of it." Maria nodded, understanding the impossible position she'd put him in. "What will you tell them?" "The truth," he said simply. That Detective Maria Santos demonstrated exceptional crisis negotiation skills before submitting her resignation. That the suspect surrendered peacefully due to her intervention. Everything else. He gestured vaguely at the playground where 30 children had been protected by forces no police manual could explain. Everything else gets filed under unexplained phenomena, and buried so deep it'll take an act of God to find it again. "Thank you," Maria said, meaning it more than he could know. "Don't thank me yet," Morrison replied, "because I'm not letting you disappear into whatever this is without backup. Tommy's putting in for a transfer to community outreach. Officially, he'll be liaising with social services on cases involving traumatized children. Unofficially." He looked at Tommy, who nodded with the grim determination of a man who'd chosen his side. "He'll be your connection to the department when things like this happen again." "When, not if," Maria observed. "After what I've seen." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Lady, I'd bet my pension there are forces in this city that have been fighting this war a lot longer than any of us realized. The difference is now they've got someone on our side who can see the battlefield." Tommy stepped forward, still cradling Yana with practiced ease. "There's something else," he said quietly. "While you were talking down the suspect, I got word from Child Services. Yana's aunt in Phoenix. She's been approved for custody. The paperwork goes through tomorrow." Maria felt her heart clench with unexpected loss. In 3 days, this silent child had become the center of everything, the catalyst that had transformed Maria's understanding of herself and the world. The thought of saying goodbye felt like tearing open wounds that had just begun to heal. "Will she be safe?" Maria asked. "Her aunt's a pediatric nurse," Tommy replied. "No criminal record, stable home, good references. More importantly," he lowered his voice, "she believes. When I told her about Yana's gift, about the things she's witnessed, she just said our family has always known some children see more than others." Yana stirred in Tommy's arms, then reached out toward Maria with small hands that carried impossible trust. When Maria took her, the child whispered something in Spanish that made Maria's breath catch. "She says the helpers told her this was always temporary," Maria translated, her voice thick with emotion. "That she was only meant to stay until you learned to see them too." The little girl pulled back to meet Maria's eyes, her face solemn with the weight of understanding beyond her years. "You'll still be able to find me," she said in English clear as crystal. "When the scared children need someone who believes their stories, you'll know where to look." "I will," Maria promised, sealing a vow she knew would shape the rest of her life. As if summoned by her words, Maria felt that familiar warmth in her chest, Sophia's presence wrapping around her heart like arms she would carry forever. The sensation was different now. Not the desperate clinging of grief, but the steady strength of love transformed into purpose. The old detective Santos would have driven home to an empty apartment, filed her reports, and tried to forget what couldn't be explained. But the woman standing in the evening mist outside Lincoln Elementary was someone new entirely. A guardian angel with calloused hands and unshakable faith, ready to stand between innocent children and the shadows that hunted them. Tomorrow, Yana would fly to Phoenix. Tomorrow, Maria would begin the work of protecting other children who saw what adults refused to acknowledge. Tonight, they had saved 30 souls from darkness, and that was miracle enough. The new beginning. 6 months later, Maria Santos sat in the passenger seat of Tommy's sedan, watching the familiar neighborhoods of East Cleveland scroll past her window. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, but underneath it she caught something else, the electric anticipation that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, the signal that somewhere nearby a child needed protection. "Third call this week," Tommy murmured, turning onto Prospect Avenue. His detective's badge had been replaced by a community outreach coordinator's ID, but his cop instincts remained sharp as ever. 10-year-old boy at Sacred Heart Elementary claiming he sees dark people following him home from school. Maria nodded, checking her phone for the message that had arrived that morning. A photo of a crayon drawing depicting stick figures with glowing eyes surrounding a small house. In the corner of the paper, rendered with surprising detail for a child's artwork, stood a woman in flowing robes with arms outstretched protectively. "When the scared children need someone who believes their stories, you'll know where to look." Yana's words had proven prophetic. In the months since her departure to Phoenix, Maria had found herself drawn to case after case, children who saw things adults dismissed, families terrorized by phenomena that existed in the spaces between what was possible and what was real. The calls came through Tommy's official channels, but Maria felt them first in the warmth that lived in her chest, where Sophia's presence had taken permanent residence. Mrs. Santos? The voice belonged to Elena Vasquez, the school counselor who had requested their intervention. She met them at Sacred Heart's entrance, her professional composure barely masking the fear in her eyes. "Thank you for coming. Marcus has been, well, his behavior has become increasingly erratic. Nightmares, difficulty concentrating, claims that shadow figures are waiting for him after dark." Maria followed the counselor through hallways decorated with children's artwork and achievement certificates, feeling the familiar tingle that meant she was approaching something significant. Behind her, Tommy moved with the quiet alertness of someone who had learned to expect the impossible. They found Marcus Delacroix in the counselor's office, a thin boy with intelligent eyes and hands that shook when he wasn't clasping them tightly together. He looked up when Maria entered, and she saw recognition flicker across his features, not of her specifically, but of someone who might actually listen. "The Dark Ones whisper about you," he said without preamble, his voice carrying that otherworldly certainty she'd come to associate with children who walked between worlds. "They're afraid of the lady who helps you see them." "Tell me about the Dark Ones, Marcus," Maria said, settling into the chair beside him with the patience she'd cultivated over months of similar conversations. "What do they look like?" "Like people but empty," he replied, his small hands sketching shapes in the air. "They follow me home from school, stand outside my bedroom window. They want me to stop talking about them, but—" He looked up at her with eyes far too old for his face. "But the bright lady says I have to keep telling the truth." Behind him, the air shimmered with barely visible movement, and Maria felt her breath catch. There, translucent as morning mist but unmistakably present, stood a figure in robes of flowing light. Not the Virgin Mary this time, but Sophia, her daughter's 8-year-old face radiant with protective determination. "She's here now, isn't she?" Maria asked softly. "The bright lady." Marcus nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks with relief so profound it was painful to witness. "She says you're going to help me fight them, that you know how to make the whispers stop." Over the next hour, Maria worked with the boy to map his experiences, identifying patterns she'd learned to recognize. The shadow entities appeared most often during moments of isolation and fear, feeding on despair while whispering suggestions of violence or self-harm. They grew stronger when disbelieved, weaker when confronted by faith and protective love. "Your parents are coming to pick you up," Maria told him as their session concluded. "I'm going to talk to them about some changes we can make to help keep you safe. Night lights, blessed medals, people who believe your story." "Will the Dark Ones go away forever?" Marcus asked. Maria considered the question, thinking of the dozens of children she'd helped over the past months, of the ongoing battle between light and shadow that played out in playgrounds and bedrooms across the city. "They might try to come back," she said honestly. "But now you know you're not alone. You have protectors watching over you, and people who will always believe what you tell them." As Tommy drove them back toward downtown, Maria's phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it to find a photo of a smiling 7-year-old girl with familiar dark eyes standing beside a woman who shared her features. The caption read, "Aunt Carmen says I start 2nd grade next week. I told her about my guardian angel friend in Ohio who helps scared children. She says maybe someday I can help too." "Why?" Maria smiled, feeling Sophia's presence pulse with approval in her chest. The old detective Santos had spent her career responding to emergencies after the damage was done. But this new version of herself, guardian, protector, believer in impossible things, stood between innocent souls and the darkness that sought to claim them. Her phone rang again. Another child, another family touched by forces beyond understanding, another chance to transform fear into hope. She answered on the first ring,